My focus today is actually on the development of transnational theological spaces of interreligious education. So I'll be addressing some of the political arenas and issues that are emerging in such programs. We have a program here at the Claremont Graduate School of Theology, programs in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, and in many other parts around the world where this notion of engaging theological education and higher education in a multi-religious setting. So thinking about the notion of safety as well as the role of the state in forming some of these conversations. So I'm presenting today from a paper that's a chapter in my upcoming book, The Politics of Interreligious Education. So in a world in which institutions, individuals, and states function beyond, and in some cases even circumvent national boundaries, the importance of examining transnational functions of education becomes an increasingly vital line of scholarly inquiry. With limited space, we will be explaining a little bit about this idea of interreligious theological education. So it's not possible to go into the nuances, but it is now an emerging field of education and also finding its way into public education through such minors and majors as interfaith studies at NYU and also in public universities. Building on the scholarship of David Ruzin, Heidi Hatzel, Maria Isasi Diaz, Ibu Patel, Catherine Cornell, Judith Burning, John Tatamano, and others, I consider 5 common components that undergird the scaffolding of interreligious education. The engagement may range from one encounter to a fully developed course of study in this area. We are now actually seeing some graduate seminaries establish interreligious education as a PhD track, as it is in the program that I direct at the Claremont Graduate School of Theology, or at the graduate level. So generally these programs include 5 areas. Programs with some comparative theological study of more than one tradition, so some sort of multiple comparative theological approach. Pedagogical features of the instruction emphasize an experiential component, such as a class in dialogic models. Very often, a normative student outcome is emphasized, that of peaceful coexistence between religions as the object of the encounter with the other. Another component that we see in such programs in higher education, whether it be in the US or in other countries, is community engagement and immersion outside of the classroom. So we see an extension of the classroom beyond the 4 walls of the classroom is encouraged and in fact curated by the instructors. Last of all, I was meeting with a group of scholars from Cairo. We are seeing a vernacular emerge transnationally around theologies of religious pluralism, interfaith engagement, hospitality, the other, the configuration of the other both from a theological as well as juristic perspective. And bridge building, all of these concepts are often emphasized in this form of study, whether it be here, again, in the US or internationally. This paper poses questions to frame the coalescing of interreligious education and theological training, and considers how institutions of transnational interreligious education are created. This is an attempt to discover ethical, philosophical, and political research areas for further development of the field by emphasizing innovative and current scholarship. So what is the first challenge that we face in looking at transnational interreligious education? The first is contesting frameworks. In different countries, the state explicitly or implicitly utilizes multiple mechanisms to engage in the enterprise of theological education. The very instructive case study of Germany and its current struggles towards establishing Islamic studies programs was outlined by Zubair Mohammed at the 2012 annual meeting in his paper, Constructing a Secular State and Democracy-Friendly Islam from Within. The government or its proxies essentially become shapers of theological education, boundary makers of access to spiritual authority, and purveyors of discursive emanations that ripple across a broad geography of religion in public and in private spaces. The government here is playing a role even in our private spaces. We may evoke the work of Sabah Mahmood in the idea of ethical cultivation spaces that are outside just merely sacred spaces. As one begins to form transnational agendas for theological education, the sources of funding, policy-based decision-making, and support of scholarly research will need to be interrogated to understand the extent that theological education reflects an advancement of national interest per state. The transnational agenda may pose a challenge to state-bound educational purposes. A state's limiting or barring of religions, recognizing the constitution of or denying the existence of a religious people has a role in forming the playing field of what constitutes legitimate theologies. The state now plays a role in legitimating certain forms of theological enterprise. Furthermore, the state's agenda may also impose extra educational pressures as international controversies are being negotiated with various accesses to power. The transnational nature of theological education, by definition, is a non-neutral square that carries with it the flavors, nuances, power dynamics, and citizen participant expectations of religious adherence. Inherent in this exploration is the role of secularities and the definition of religion. As the current conception of interreligious education seems to promote seeks to promote a definition of pluralism, one might imagine varying definitions of pluralism, competing articulations of secularism, and complex demarcations of how religion is defined in its legal sense, and also in the discourse of what constitutes religion within a social and political context. We live in an age of plurality of pluralism. Pluralisms. That's the whole thesis. You need to get your thesis. You need to add the S. These days, anything is exciting in the academic world if you just add an S to it. Islams, Christianities, anyways. It's an insider joke. It is time to add to the pantheon of scholars often cited in interreligious education. In addition to Diana Eck, Paul Knitter, William Connolly, Robert Bellah, instructors can consider the study of revolutionary interspiritualities, such as a Duboisian ethic documented by Dwight Hopkins. Religion as the sole epistemic commitment for the basis of pluralism often ignores the fractal genealogical patterns of lived religions. So scholars have begun to unearth the many lenses through which pluralism can be sieved. Another obscure view of pluralism is conservative pluralism, described by John Charles Duffy at the 2012 AAR annual meeting, Coming to Terms with Pluralism, Evangelical Responses to Mitt Romney's Presidential Campaign. I would add here another form of conservative pluralism is emerging in Muslim-majority nations as well. While there was major laudatory action taken on the Marrakesh Declaration recently around religious pluralism, who was invited to the table to make such a declaration, and who were the scholars that are state-sanctioned in such spaces? So thinking about this idea of pluralism as inherently a liberal agenda or progressive religious task is very limiting. Thus, we have a plurality of pluralisms. There are historical, cultural, communal, and individual meaning of terms that are often proposed as conventional values or wisdoms. It is imperative that we do not allow this universal lexicon to prevail. The classroom, in its microcosmic representation of the outer universe, is a laboratory for embodied aspects of political functions. As instructors, we must disarm the notion of a safe classroom and disabuse students of an expectation of a risk-free learning experience, especially if peace between religions is a normative outcome promoted in interreligious education. Betty Barrett argues for an alternative construction to the foundational element of safety in the classroom, as the organizing principle in her essay Is Safety Dangerous? A critical examination of the classroom as safe space. I am not speaking of physical safety here or intentional harm. Barrett offers an alternative framing. While educators, this is Barrett's work, while educators may not be able to directly observe, monitor, or enforce intrapersonal states, they can indeed observe, monitor, and enforce student behavior in the classroom. A reconceptualization of the classroom safety to incorporate a primary focus on civility is essentially a movement away from concern with psychological constructs invisible to behavioral constructs visible, as the focus of classroom management. Although it is true that educators reinforce and/or prohibit certain student behaviors because of their potential psychological, emotional, and spiritual impacts on their students, educators cannot ethically assure students that the classroom will only produce positive psychological states in them. Indeed, learning growth and development may well be the fruit of painful and frustrating labor. Educators may not be able to, nor should they try, to promise students in good faith that intellectual enterprise and scholarly exchanges are safe and comfortable endeavors. And keep in mind the risks here. I have a Pakistani Christian student in my program, and safety here, I'm talking about it particularly when we're thinking about intellectual safety and also theological variance and difference and the culture that we create in such spaces. The physical risks that we carry in spaces vary depending on our positionality. So I think that's very important as a transnational lens to put on Barrett's work. They can, however, promise behaviors while they are engaging in such endeavors that they will not be subjected to certain behaviors on their part of their that they will not be subjected to particular behaviors on the part of their peers that threaten their social and physical integrity of the learning environment. Barrett suggests that this exclusive framing of classroom comfortability originating by the professor can stunt intellectual development. She points out the impossibility for students, particularly racially, socially, and economically marginalized students. How do we prepare students? She essentially says the real world is not safe. The classroom needs to represent the reality. How do we prepare students to navigate these complex, rich, and choppy waters as scholars and negotiators of their identity? So I wanted to point out here that one of the things we find as a major issue in the interfaith movement in the United States is a major sense of American exceptionalism. And this is another problem that we face in interreligious education as we are developing these spaces. And this is a conference on religious freedom. So the U.S. interfaith movement is a driving force for proposing and developing many localized efforts, moving some Christian institutions towards more inclusive populations, faculties, and institutional structures. If this American-based movement promotes a form of pluralism that is grounded in a fulfillment of rhetoric that implies the United States is the yardstick by which pluralism is performed at its highest level, this will blind the transnational theological educational model from gleaning lessons and practices that demonstrate multiple ways of managing and developing pluralistic resources across and within diverse traditions. As an example, in the experiment of building an interreligious graduate seminary, the Claremont School of Theology experienced more support from African United Methodists who recognized the necessity of interreligious education due to the interreligious nature of families and communities in African settings where United Methodist leaders have to function. To assume that the American context produces the greatest level of an inclusive social, political, and cultural consciousness will not only centralize U.S.-based rhetoric, it also limits the scrutiny of the foundations and the assumptions of the American interfaith movement. Additionally, it should not extend to scholarly production on interreligious education. Some of the most groundbreaking work can be found from scholars in Norway, the Netherlands, and many others. At the 2013 AAR annual meeting, Jason Springs proposed a series of excellent questions in his Transforming Conflict on Sacred Ground on the limits and risks of interreligious engagement in context of structural and cultural violence. I would extend this inquiry into interreligious education and transnational settings with these points. If there is a demonstrated theology of interreligious engagement for each group within an interreligious setting, implicitly functional at the table is also political theology of how the individual or aggregate deems an appropriate relationship with their state and ethics of global political identities and communities. This political theology functions most powerfully with the convener who originates an interreligious convening educational process or institution. So imagining the government being the convening power, they are essentially, in some ways, playing a theological role or endorsing some form of a theology of interreligious engagement. Another gloss on political theology would require an exploration into the states that comprise a transnational effort and into how each player in an interreligious endeavor relates to bolstering or challenging the sacral elements of that state or corporate system of states. Educational systems are by far one of the most robust articulations, indeed ritual spaces, that carry the values of a particular society and pose an opportunity to challenge or buttress existing modalities of citizen consciousness formation. So I think I have a lot more to talk about, but I wanted to essentially just raise for us some questions about thinking through these notions of how scholarship is affected when sacred and profane spaces, epistemologies, and institutions are often tied into this idea of citizen consciousness, citizen development. And how do we begin to think through questions like the politics of hybridity, of not just students, but of communities that historically have had hybrid identities. When we have often this notion of participation within a state-sanctioned religious community. What do we do when there are communities that challenge those forms and constructions of religion? So Kwak Poilan in her work talks about the notion of this idea of not all hybridities are equal. And I would argue that in international settings, hybrid identities, religious identities, are the ones that pose the most threat to the culmination of power of a state with a singular religious identity. Minoritized religious traditions, especially within a larger community, are also the ones that pose not just a theological challenge, but a challenge to the state, and are therefore often the ones that are most oppressed. Not only most oppressed, but their actual teaching and preservation of their knowledge is not one that is state-sanctioned. So how do we engage when we have communities that have hybrid identities? Because one of the things we notice is that stories of religious purity are often stories that are connected to the power of the purity of the state and the power that a particular economic system, ideological system. And so if one has a hybrid religious identity, this is an issue. And not just in the modern sense, the ultra-contemporary source of multiple religious identities or belonging, but there are communities that have historically been perceived as having hybrid religious identities, often just as a matter of course in which ritual will be shared. If you go to Kashmir where I was born, rituals are shared across traditions because historically that functionally, it's not just a theological issue, it's the way that sacred spaces are exchanged and engaged. So those are some of the questions we need to think about. Are these embodied hybridities? So how open are theological institutions to embodied hybridities that function not merely as a postmodern identity, but in some cultural context as the very norm and not the aberration of religious identity? How are courses organized? How are questions of purity, authority, legitimacy, and representation of traditions investigated and exhibited in organizational structures that function across what might be more fluid lines than some might assume or be willing to visibilize? I also have a very a long exposition on questions of indigeneity and indigenous communities and the invisibility of indigenous communities, both legally as well as in the construction of transnational legal regimes around religion. And so I think one of the questions we have to keep in mind here is that I've become aware of the lack of discussion of traditions that engage large sets of indigenous traditions. Assumptions of a set-like text, like a creedal code, allow for a comparative theology enterprise when theology is constituted in this way. So we've been talking about this notion in comparative theology of an over-textualization of comparative theology, but also an inclusion of text-based traditions in the protection of religious freedom. And what do we do when both practices as well as scholars do not have such a text-based practice. So increasingly, as a transnational eye is brought into this area of theological education, this question will find its way penetrating the potentially highly limiting constructs of interreligious spaces. The danger here is that the definition of religion may be expanded, but its curious genesis remains in the particularities of a set form. Newer landscapes that are created still carry this litmus test, and ironically, it is interesting because this litmus test is based on traditions that are far newer than many of these indigenous traditions that pre-exist tens of thousands of years. So there's a certain historical irony in this work. And in conclusion, the intersection of interreligious education and transnational theological education excites me. It makes for a more intelligent, plastic, and inclusive institutions in higher education. Perhaps the practical challenge is this: how does one forward these rousing lines of inquiry while staying within a realm of reality that still works in established systems of religion, theological education, state functionality, so that the scholar is not outcast without a relevant venue and set of interlocutors to do their work? Thank you.